October 1940. The German blitz on England was in full swing. London was hardest hit, night after night, by the German Luftwaffe. Most of the Dockland area was destroyed, and street after street were reduced to the shells of once proud buildings. The all-important railway terminals, such as Waterloo, sustained many direct hits. Charing Cross station was put out of action completely on at least 2 occasions, which meant that passenger traffic was restricted for a short time. The track, signalling system, roof girders and an 8-car electric train were severely damaged. 6 people were killed in the raid and 27 injured. Considering the Luftwaffe was aiming for Docklands 6 miles away in East London, blitzing stations was still a hit-and-miss affair. London's worst raid was on the night of April the 16th in 1941. Charing Cross was so damaged that the station was closed completely for 3 days until Platform 1 was finally opened. The station hotel and number 6 platform with an empty train were badly damaged by the ensuing fire, which had also virtually demolished the wooden platform extensions onto the river bridge. Early in 1944, German bombs were again taking their toll on London's stations. Paddington had to be repaired when platforms 6 and 7 were damaged, but by then the passengers had become hardened to the carnage and carried on regardless. The railways were absolutely essential during the Second World War, as all power supplies, heating and lighting depended on coal. Coal for the gasworks, coal for the production of iron and steel, coal to run the steam trains themselves, and coal for the travelling steam crane, which was the only mechanical help for the railmen and soldiers clearing up the mess. Repair work was extremely labour-intensive, which meant that railway staff had to be augmented by the military, who were gaining valuable training for the future when the tide would turn in Europe. Railwaymen led dangerous lives during the bombing, as they were expected to carry on working when the sirens wailed the alert. But when the danger was near, they could take to the air raid shelters in the yards. Signalmen were very vulnerable to flying glass from their boxes, but were usually the last to take shelter in small steel cabinets sited next to or in their signal boxes. Early in the Blitz, trains were kept moving but had to stop at the nearest signal box for instructions. At the first convenient station, the passengers were given the chance to take shelter, but in practice most people preferred to stay on board while the crew donned their helmets and kept the train going at a slow speed. The repair bill for war damage on the railways was over £30 million. That's nearly £1 billion by today's prices. A gesture to maintain civic pride in the face of adversity was the naming of the City of London locomotive at Euston Station in 1943.
All the railway companies are playing their vital role in keeping us all supplied with the essential needs of winning this war. In July, the chairman of the LMS Railway, Sir Thomas Royden, accompanied by Lady Royden, were proud to welcome the city's Lord Mayor, Sir Samuel Joseph and Lady Joseph, to a brief ceremony at Euston to unveil the nameplate City of London, number 6245, the very latest of the Coronation-class express engines.
Another LMSR class, the Jubilee 460s, were transporting the thousands of GIs to join British soldiers preparing for the Second Front. In 1942, the tiny Mediterranean island of Malta had been awarded the George Cross for its people's courage.
November the 4th, Euston, when Sir Thomas and Lady Royden welcomed the distinguished Governor of Malta during the island's ordeal, General Sir William Dobbie and Lady Dobbie, to rename Jubilee number 5616 as Malta GC. Accompanying the Governor and Lady Dobbie was Flight Lieutenant Lardner Burke, DFC, one of the brave Spitfire pilots who defended the island during the long siege of Malta. Sharing the footplate were driver John Gregory, himself a military medalist of the First World War, and fireman Charles Russell, who was in the evacuation from Dunkirk. They must have felt a sober pride as they welcomed their distinguished guests onto Malta's footplate and gave them a short ride before returning to their vital wartime duties. Keep up the good work, lads.
A year earlier, in 1941, the first merchant navy, the Pacific, designed by Oliver Bulleid, had stunned everyone who saw it. His West Country Pacific, which was a lighter engine, wasn't completed till after the war. Like the merchant navies, the West Countries were called mixed traffic locomotives, even though their use on freight services was fairly limited. Bulleid Pacifics had a number of innovations. 3 sets of chain-driven valve gear, enclosed in an oil bath which often caught fire, thermic siphons in the steel firebox, and extra holes in the frames and wheels to save weight. It also had a boiler pressure as high as 280 psi. Some of these 462 engines were not named after West Country places, but after RAF leaders, aircraft, airfields and squadrons involved in the Battle of Britain, the RAF's finest hour. The characteristic exhaust was caused by Bulleid's Lemaitre type double blast pipe. Unlike the merchant navies, the light Pacifics could go all over the Southern Railway system, and in particular the lines west of Exeter, which was what they were actually built for. But because of trouble with all those innovations, many of these engines were rebuilt later. The power of the light Pacific was 31,000 pounds, giving it a top speed of at least 100 miles per hour. Bolero, the build-up of American forces in Britain from 1942 for the proposed invasion of Europe, Operation Overlord, included locomotives and rolling stock for use on the continent. One of the engines brought over from the USA was this tank engine, number 30075. Now on the Swanage Railway, it worked in Yugoslavia for over 40 years, after it was sent over from Britain in 1946. It was built for temporary war services, so it is quite remarkable that it is still in such fine working condition. But the principal American locomotives brought over were the purpose-built standard heavy freight S-160 class 280s. After they were shipped over from America, they were made ready at works in Britain before being used on the hard-pressed railways for 2 years. In late 1944, they were repaired and sent over to the continent after the Normandy landings. These were some of the variety of locomotive types designed by the US Army Transportation Corps, which were built in large numbers at the Baldwin Lima and Alco Locomotive Works in the USA. Some 400 S-160s were put to work on British railways to help cope with the increase in freight traffic caused by Bolero. In spite of a design fault which caused a few deaths when boilers blew up, Their totally un-English appearance caused quite a stir. Austerity was the order of the day, so the locomotives were designed with no frills, which meant building needed few special materials. With fabricated rather than forged parts, they were capable of running on poor track and were easy to repair in wartime conditions. They were not designed to last, but many of them continued to run successfully for decades. The British austerities were designed for the War Department. The WD-280s and later the 210s were derived from the highly successful LMS 8F 280 from William Stanier. 935 280s and 150 210s were built between 1943 and 1945. 3 of these impressive 210s still exist today. One of them is now called Gordon and runs on the Severn Valley Railway. The 210 was heavier than the 280, but because the weight was distributed over 10 axles, it was in fact lighter. The problem of getting 10 coupled axles around sharp curves was overcome by having no flanges on the middle pair of driving wheels. In the USA and Europe, air brakes were the norm, so all these military heavies had to be fitted with Westinghouse brake pumps on the side of the smoke bowl. With 34,215 pounds of power and driving wheels half an inch larger than the 280, the 210 could go faster because it steamed more freely. On the continent later in the war, they would often be seen hauling passenger trains, as they do now on the Severn Valley Railway, which is mostly single track. This means that tablets have to be exchanged between the driver and signalman to ensure that Gordon has the right of way on the next stretch of single track. Gordon was originally WD number 73651 and was used on the Longmoor military railway for training purposes, hence the LMR on the tender, which does not stand for London Midland Region. It has a bigger boiler than the 280s, a 40 square foot firebox made of steel with a rocking grate, like in the American locos. To fire it was about as much as any one man could manage. It was renumbered WD-600 in 1952, but Longmoor ceased operations in 1969 and Gordon now belongs to the National Army Museum, who lease it to the Severn Valley Railway. In the southeast, the Kent and East Sussex Railway is still going strong at the end of the 20th century.
The line was built in 1900, which is very, very late for railways. It was the first light railway in the country to reach areas that have been missed out in railway, mainly of the 1840s and 1850s. It connected Robertsbridge in East Sussex with Headcorn in Kent. Made very modest profits initially, but because it was built very cheaply, the stations were usually a way away from the villages they were supposed to serve, so it was very vulnerable to road competition from the 1920s onwards. Started losing money in 1926, struggled on through the war when it became an important secondary route to the coast, taking lots of materials down to the south coast when the main lines were affected by bombing. And then after the war it was nationalised and became part of British Railways for 6 brief years when they decided that it couldn't go on running uneconomic trains, and it closed in 1954.
During the conflict, the military were very short of shunting engines. Again, the Americans stepped in with about 370 060 tanks. Like the 280s, they looked typically American and were scaled down for our smaller loading gauge. The WD engines were of the traditional British design of industrial inside cylinder saddle tanks, but for rapid production they were modified for economy in manpower. They were built by 6 different manufacturers between 1943 and 1945. This British type was also built after the war until 1953. These austerity shunting engines didn't often appear on the home railways during the war, as most of them were used at military depots. But after the war, 75 were taken over by the LNER, while many others were put to work at the collieries and other industrial sites.
First is number 65, which was built in 1943 by the Vulcan Iron Works in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was shipped across the Atlantic in kit form as part of the preparations for D-Day. Similar engines were actually then transported across the Channel, but number 65 and its partner number 238 that are here at the Kent and East Sussex Railway didn't see action in the war, and afterwards they went to first Southampton docks and then later to the Ashford Wagon Works, where they were used as shunting engines before they were saved for preservation here at the Kent and East Sussex Railway.
Typically, number 65 has a parallel boiler, outside cylinders and 3 enormous domes on top of the boiler. 2 of them are sandboxes. It's now in its Southern livery without its name Maunsell, which it carried until recently. Because the Southern equipped it for working on the docks, it was fitted with a radio telephone. The British as well as the American tank engines were sturdy and capable of hauling quite heavy trains over lightly laid tracks with sharp curves. The Kent and East Sussex Railway number 24, Rolvenden, was formerly WD number 200 and was recently called William H. Austin. In contrast to the modern stock being hauled by number 65, number 24 is hauling an extraordinary collection of vintage coaches. These wartime tanks have proved very popular with the preservation groups, and no less than 43 of these engines, and 5 of the American ones, are working today on railways up and down the country. The preservation groups have done a magnificent job in restoring them and painting them in attractive liveries, a far cry from the drab black of the war. Number 24's train comprises an LNWR director's saloon with verandas, an SECR family saloon, an SECR full second, and a GER composite and a district railway full first. In spite of its 23,870 pounds of power, it seems to be having quite a struggle with this lot, which consists of old 4- and 6-wheelers. Some of them were rescued from such places as allotments, where they had been used as hen houses.
Locomotives are the key to victory. Production of a utility engine is now underway at a works in Scotland. RAF loco-busting not only draws the lifeblood of enemy transport, it raises a problem for us when we invade Europe. Designers working to Ministry of Supply orders got out plans for an austerity locomotive for use first on British railways, then overseas with the invading armies. Working to an approved design for an engine to haul 700 tons, it was found that in steel castings alone, the weight was reduced from 21 tons to 4. No less important in times of manpower shortage, the design saves 6,000 man-hours on every engine made. Old Robert Lithgow, 70, has been with the firm 43 years, and even he isn't the veteran here. Thomas Alexander is 76 and started here 60 years ago when Backy was 4pence an ounce. Tommy Puan comes from China near Chongqing. He wants to be able to make engines to beat the Japs. All sorts of jobs on austerity locomotives are done by girls. It was a memorable day at the works when the first engine was completely assembled. It has the standard British gauge, 4 foot 8½, but it can be quickly adapted to run anywhere on the continent. No time was lost before stoking up for boiler tests. One reason why these locomotives can be made quickly is that they're not built primarily for speed. Heavy haulage between 30 and 40 miles an hour is all that's wanted. When locomotive number 1 rolled out of the works, the Minister of Supply, Sir Andrew Duncan, was on the footplate. He had good cause for satisfaction. While Britain can turn out locomotives in plenty, Fighter Command and the Red Armies are taking crippling toll of Nazi transport. It's good to know that when the second front is open, the Army will have all the engines it wants.
Germany, 1990. The first locomotive from the Krupp Works in Essen, bedecked with ornamental greenery, was a Prussian G10 010O. Krupp was renowned for making heavy armaments and munitions during the First World War and had grown into one of the largest armament producers in the world. But German railwaymen of the Deutsche Reichsbahn were equally as dedicated and skilled as the British and Americans. Who else but a dedicated railwayman would spring out of bed at 2:30 in the morning and cycle off to the locomotive depot with such enthusiasm? He was the firelighter whose job was to light the boiler ready for the driver and fireman to take over. Once steam pressure was high enough, the driver and fireman would board the engine with their kit. They had to oil up the cranks and bearings, the driving rods and connecting rods, and the valve gear of their big 282 tank before driving out of the typically German roundhouse, onto the turntable and into the yard. Once in the yard, they had to refuel the locomotive with enough water and coal for the journey ahead. They would couple up, and after a signal from the guard, they'd be off on the job for the day. Krupp went over to locomotive building directly after the First World War, when Germany was forbidden to manufacture any armaments by the victorious Allies. Germany began to rearm during the 1930s under the Nazis and their Führer Adolf Hitler, so the Krupp works were turned back more and more to the manufacture of armaments, but it did continue to produce locomotives until 1941. Our 282 tank shunted some of its wagons into the sidings of a local yard. This was done by the train crew, who sometimes used a clever little device called a scotch as a brake. The goods trains were made up of wagons that were large by British standards. There were various types, and the guards, brakesmen, or shunters, could shelter in small huts on some of them. Because many of the goods trains had continuous brakes, there was no need for a guard's van. Continental passenger coaches were also more spacious than in Britain, and as platforms were much lower or non-existent, they seemed even larger. They also had to have several rows of footboards for the passengers to clamber up into the carriages. In Germany in particular, there was a dense network of local lines with frequent services even on Sundays, unlike in Britain. You could also look out from the veranda at the back of some trains, particularly the local ones. This gave an interesting view of the towns and countryside. the main lines there was very heavy traffic of both passenger and freight trains. German trains always passed on the right rather than on the left as in Britain. Even the signal arms were back to front. In 1939, Krupp celebrated the birth of its 2000th locomotive. 06001 and 002 were massive 484 streamlined express locomotives, and they were the only two ever built. In fact, there was no real need for such powerful express engines. Perhaps another example of Nazi megalomania. But as streamliners, they were not unique, as there were some 200 streamlined 462s of various classes already running on the Deutsche Reichsbahn at that time. Like numerous German locomotives, both engines were badly damaged in air raids towards the end of the war, and then they were finally put on the scrap heap. Even in peacetime, the British railway companies followed a general policy of self-sufficiency in the manufacture and repair of all their equipment. Because of this, they had a range and variety of major workshops, unmatched in any other industry. Iron, steel, metal fabrication and woodwork were all part of the internal skills possessed by the railwaymen. The Southern Railway's Eastleigh Works, for instance, were ordered to produce no less than 1,000 railway wagons for military use in Persia to carry supplies to Russia, but they had to be delivered in 10 short weeks. The works were amongst the finest heavy engineering shops in the country. In quality and skill they were unrivaled and were vital to a nation struggling to keep its independence. Because of the shortage of manpower on the railways, 105,703 women had been employed by 1943. They were to be found in practically every part of the system, including the workshops where they had been trained to become engineers. Like the men alongside them, they had soon learnt the skills of core making, coppersmithing, welding, turning, joinery and concrete mixing. "13,000 aircraft were to be unleashed on Normandy. 867 were to be gliders full of troops. Again, the railway workshops were utilised in the manufacture of Horsa gliders. Because the engineering staff were ideally placed, they could adapt to the manufacturing of all kinds of military hardware, including tanks, aircraft, and even small ships. This was done by cutting down the construction of new railway equipment and limiting repair work to the bare essentials. Assembly had to be done on the spot in the works. Then the women literally sewed the fabric onto the frames before the unenviable task of applying liberal quantities of foul-smelling dope over the whole construction. Guns, bombs, shells, cartridges and even barrage balloons were manufactured in railway workshops up and down the country. Eastleigh found itself responsible for manufacturing the entire tailplane section of the Horses. At its peak, Production of aircraft parts constituted more than 3/5 of the total volume of war work completed in the railway workshops. What must have been galling to these gallant workers was that the gliders generally would only be used once, as many of them would be irreparably damaged as they landed in the war zones. On the night of June the 5th, 1944, the massive invasion of Normandy began. Bombing was followed by airborne troops delivered from Dakotas and by gliders. Before D-Day, Allied air forces had flown 200,000 sorties and delivered 200,000 tons of bombs in only 2 months. The French railway system was virtually at a standstill, with all the bridges over the Seine between Paris and the Channel destroyed. Railway stations such as Caen were almost completely demolished. The utter carnage of Caen was repeated all over Europe as a result of Operation Overlord. It was a bitter irony that the Allies had done a magnificent job of virtually demolishing a railway system that they now had to repair for their push through France and into Germany. Some of the locomotives suffered irreparable damage, with fittings blown off, joints loosened or cracked, frames cracked or bent beyond repair. Damaged connecting and coupling rods, valve gear, cylinders and boilers all contributed to huge dead weights stuck on twisted rails. Somehow these heavy hulks had to be moved before the railways could be operational again. In many cases, the track work was so badly damaged that rebuilding had to be started from scratch. This meant that the track bed had to be cleared, ballast redistributed, and sleepers relaid. Royal engineers of a railway construction company were helped and directed by civilian railwaymen to lift and move old bent rail, replacing it before lining up and fastening down the new rail to the sleepers with screw spikes. Cheminot and sapper worked together. Cheminots used long-handled ballast forks to remove ballast. After the beachheads had been established in Normandy, one of the most pressing problems was to re-equip the French railways with rolling stock to be used in army lines of communication. Locomotives and rolling stock were shipped in large numbers through Southampton to the continent. Because the train ferry terminal at Cherbourg had been out of action until the 4th of August 1944, 2 040 diesel locomotives were loaded onto transporters and landed on the open beaches at Corsair on the 26th of July. The 153 horsepower diesel had been loaded by crane onto a Mark I transporter at the King George V dock at Southampton, accompanied by a tractor which hauled its heavy load up the beach. By August the 4th, WD-32, 29, 30 and 33 were hard at work at the depots at Corsair, Bayeux and Caen. The capture of Caen was one of the main objectives of the British Second Army. Its capitulation was finally achieved on the 9th of July after a heavy attack by 450 RAF bombers. The town had been heavily bombed and shelled. The bridges were destroyed. The station yard and tracks were almost obliterated. But the captured lines were soon put back into working order. Some of the reconstruction had to be done at a fairly basic level because of a lack of heavy gear. Every part of the railway had been affected. Even the station buffet was put out of action. With so many engines wrecked in the bombing, improvisation was the order of the day. In the best military tradition, the sappers converted a jeep by fitting flanged wheels so that it could be run on the railway. Even a powered trolley had to be used for transporting personnel. Number 21 bridge over the River Orne had been cut at either end by the Germans. But the line was restored on 4 75-foot, 2-girder deck type unit construction railway bridges, spanning the existing piers and abutments. The double track opened on the 26th of August. By the middle of the month, 65-ton USATC Whitcomb 650 horsepower diesel-electric locomotives had been sent across the channel. Further along the line, the level crossing was manned, with the keeper using flags to direct the rail and road traffic. In the absence of signalling equipment, another flagman was stationed on the end of bridge number 4. Some engines had a white painted outline as a blackout precaution to help them to be seen in the dark. Unlike Britain, the Continentals used screw couplings, which meant that the shunter had to have a safe place to go during the delicate operation. Once the coupling was completed, the driver moved the master switch from neutral to forward, and the power handle moved on to supply traction current to the 4 motors, one on each axle. At Caen, the departure indicator board for platform D was changed using a certain amount of improvisation. As time went on, the station took on the look of normality. Before the war, the French railways had 460,000 wagons. By the liberation, 74,000 of them had been damaged. The rest were either destroyed or stolen by the retreating Germans, leaving 230,000 wagons serviceable. A transportation and engineer stores depot along the Caen-Bayeux line was opened for traffic on the 12th of August, which was essential to accelerate the repairs more quickly. But the railways had to keep moving while signs of the former German occupation were still evident. A notice signed by the district commander forbade photography or sketching of military objects of any kind. Day by day, track by track and sleeper by sleeper, the French railway system was being rebuilt by an army of soldiers and civilians. In the planning stages for a successful re-entry into the continent, it was rightly assumed that all sea rail terminals would be destroyed. This meant that not only would temporary terminals have to be built, but any rail ferries would have to be adapted with special ramps for the engines and rolling stock to disembark. So a 120-foot long ramp bridge was added to the stern slipway of the ferries, with a lifting frame that raised and lowered it onto the key bearings. It wasn't until October 1944 that any British engines were ferried across. War Department Austerity 210 engines were rolled off, in this case from a daffodil-type ferry at Dieppe. The locomotives and their tenders were landed with no control before being lined up, ready to go to work. Just as in Cornwall, Dieppe had been hard hit by the Allies, where locomotives that were not too badly damaged had to be re-railed. Sometimes jacks had to be used, as on this former État 141 class engine and its tender. Any locomotives that were salvageable were cleaned up and were put back to work. The relentless repairs to the railway network continued all over Europe. These huge, heavy engines were often embedded, which meant many back-breaking hours of work for the sappers and the French railway workers. As 1944 turned into 1945, the Allies continued their long march to Germany itself. The thousands of gangs of railway workers and troops followed behind, repairing and building the tracks for the vital movement of munitions and supplies needed by the Allied armies and air forces. The mammoth task of getting the European railways back to some sort of normality was a feat of organisation, logistics and sheer determination from all the railwaymen and their military comrades across the continent. On Wednesday the 2nd of May 1945, Russian Premier Stalin announced the fall of Berlin. This was followed by the unconditional surrender of Germany on May the 7th. Hitler's Third Reich had not lasted for 1,000 years as he had predicted, and the Nazi scourge had been ended at huge cost in men, money, and enormous sacrifices on both sides. Today, the North Yorkshire Moors Preservation Society not only run many of the wartime engines and rolling stock, but every year it celebrates the gallantry of all railwaymen and women who worked so tirelessly during those dark days, with its Steam at War weekend. So, to get the flavour and atmosphere of those times, why don't you join in next year?